The Quran seems to suggest that Christianity is true. Welcome to the Ryan Holmes podcast, where our goal is to encourage Christian thinking and Christian living. This week we are bringing you episode 28. If you are enjoying this podcast, would you please give it a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts and leave us a review, and that'll just help get it in front of more people, or you can leave us a review on whatever other audio platform you might be using. You can also support the work that I'm doing financially by joining up at our locals community. That's ryanhomespodcast.locals.com, and you can subscribe there for just $5 a month. If you prefer video format, you can also check out our YouTube channel and subscribe there. Like the videos, share them, comment, and that'll also help get the podcast in front of more people. And if you have any questions, you can send me an email to ryanhomespodcast@gmail.com. I will link to everything in the show notes below, and you will be able to find it all there. And I hope that today you will enjoy the episode. This week we are starting somewhat of a series entitled Differences. It's going to be a series that it's not necessarily going to be all in sequential order. We might be doing some other episodes in between and whatnot, interviews, but I want to at least start this where we're going to be covering a different religion each time we do an episode in this series. So that's why it's called Differences. So we are going to be covering our first religion this week, and it is the religion of Islam. And so I'm looking forward to talking about this, giving you just an idea of what it's, the historical background and teachings and different things like that, difficulties that Islam has, and so on and so forth. So we're going to be talking about this stuff today, our very first episode in this series called Differences. So we will be comparing Islam to Christianity. So I hope that you will enjoy, and we're going to just dive right in because we have a lot to cover today and a lot to talk about. So we're going to do exactly that and start by looking at some of the origins of Islam, where it came from, how it got started, and whatnot. So basically, Islam originated with a man known as Muhammad, and I'm sure that everybody listening has probably heard about Islam in general and Muhammad, which is their prophet, and this is something that originated with him. Muhammad was born in AD 570, so over 500 years after Jesus' death and resurrection, and he was born in the city of Mecca, which is modern-day Saudi Arabia. Something to note real quick, we're going to see that Muhammad has some things to say about Jesus, about his life, about his death and whatnot, and we should be very cautious when someone living at least over 500 years after the life of Jesus tries to make truth claims about his life and about his death. We are probably better off referencing the eyewitness testimony that is written within 30 to 40 years of Jesus' life and death. That's just something that we should be aware of and understand, kind of the dating of when Muhammad was around, and then also when the Quran, their holy book and texts, were compiled and written. But anyways, the culture that Muhammad was born into was a pagan culture and polytheistic culture, which is just the worship of many gods. It is claimed that in AD 610, Muhammad was visited by the angel Gabriel. And yes, this is the same angel Gabriel that we find in the biblical accounts that appeared to Daniel and to the Virgin Mary. Muhammad claimed that he continued to receive angelic visions and revelations from that point on, after experiencing that meeting or that visitation from the angel Gabriel, and these visions, these revelations, these became the teachings of Muhammad and ultimately the text of the Quran. Muslims believe that in AD 620, Muhammad was brought by night to Jerusalem on the back of a heavenly horse by the angel Gabriel. This can be found in Surah chapter 17 and verse 1 of the Quran. Surah is just another word for chapter, so that's what I'll be referencing. You'll hear that word throughout the episode today. But while in Jerusalem, it is said that Muhammad conversed with Jesus, Moses, and Abraham, and then was taken up to heaven for a night. So that's kind of a little bit of the origins and summary. But let's now look at some kind of core beliefs within the Islamic religion and what Muslims believe. So first of all, they believe that there is one God who is called Allah. Allah literally means the God. The Quran teaches that Allah is all-knowing, mighty, compassionate, merciful, sovereign, and loving. One might conclude that this would be the same God as found in the Bible. And then they would also possibly conclude that based on these facts that Muslims and Christians worship the same God. So do Christians and Muslims worship the same God? Do we just call God something different? Do we address him as something different, but really we're worshiping the same God? The short answer is no. But we're gonna look at some major differences between the God presented in the Quran and the God presented in the Bible. First example, the Bible teaches that God is triune in nature: the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, meaning that there are three persons to the Godhead, all God, but distinct roles in the Godhead. That's what the Bible teaches. The Quran does not teach that God is triune. In fact, there are direct teachings in the Quran that combat the idea of a triune God. It goes as far to say that believing that God has a son or is a trinity of persons is an unforgivable sin known as a shirk. Surah chapter 112 and verses 1 through 4 says this: Say, He is God, the One, God the Absolute. He begets not, nor was he begotten, and there is none comparable to him. Surah chapter 4 verse 48. God does not forgive association with him, but he forgives anything less than that to whomever he wills. Whoever associates anything with God has devised a monstrous sin. So the Bible and Christianity is a God that is triune. The Quran and Islam is a God that is not triune. Second example, the Bible teaches that God is omnibenevolent or all-loving. The Quran teaches that Allah is not all-loving, specifically that Allah does not love the sinner. The Bible, however, does teach that God loves even the sinner or the unbeliever. Surah chapter 2 and verse 276 says that God does not love any sinful ingrate. Chapter 3 verse 32 says, Say, obey God and the messenger, but if they turn away, God does not love the faithless. Chapter 4 verse 36, God does not love the arrogant show-off. Chapter 5 verse 64, God does not love the corrupters. Chapter 6 and verse 141, he does not love the wasteful. So, according to the Quran, if you are ungrateful, if you are an unbeliever, if you are prideful, a corrupter, and wasteful, God does not love you, or Allah does not love you. Now, the Bible does paint a different picture of who God is. John 3, verses 16 through 17 say this. For God so loved the world, that's everyone, that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have eternal life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, that's everyone, but in order that the world might be saved through him. Still talking about everyone. Romans chapter 5 and verse 7 through 8. For one will scarcely die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person one would dare even to die. But God shows his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. So, in the state of being sinners, God still demonstrated his love to us by taking our sin upon himself in his death on the cross. So, another distinct difference. Third example, the Bible teaches us that the believer is adopted into the family of God, and we are encouraged to address God as Father, and that God is a fatherly figure for us. There is opportunity for a personal relationship with the Creator God. The Quran and Islam do not have this same concept of God. Allah is more of a remote judge who isn't personally involved in the affairs of mankind. Islam is about service, submission, and obedience to Allah, rather than a close fatherly type relationship. So we looked at the fact that the first kind of belief in Islam is that God is one and he is called Allah. The second would be the belief in prophets. The belief in prophets. Muhammad taught that there have been 124,000 prophets sent from Allah down throughout the history of mankind. Some of these prophets are familiar names of individuals mentioned even in the Bible, people who came more than 1,000 years before Muhammad, names like Abraham, Moses, David, Elijah, John the Baptist, and even Jesus. Believe it or not, Muhammad taught that these men were actually prophets of Islam, and again, even Jesus. So here's the problem for the Muslim in believing this truth, especially about the characters or the individuals that are mentioned in the Bible. So nothing that these men did or said has anything to do with Islam. Islam, Muhammad, Allah are nowhere to be found. They say things that are quite frankly in opposition to Islam. So the question is, why wouldn't the Muslim then heed anything that is said from these individuals? Here's the solution. According to the Quran, the final and the most highly respected prophet of Allah is Muhammad. So this would then mean that his teachings supersede all others who came before him. Jesus is held as a prophet of Allah, but Muhammad sought to strip Jesus of his deity and treat him as a mere man. So Muhammad is not really speaking of the same Jesus found in the Bible. He has to ignore a majority of texts in the Bible to hold to his views of Jesus. Again, we should be cautious of someone who is presenting information about Jesus whose writings came almost 600 years after Jesus lived and died. We are much better off referencing and referring to the eyewitness testimony that is written to within about 30 to 40 years of Jesus' death. The third belief is the belief in angels. So Muslims believe that angels function as guardians, recorders, and messengers for Allah. They believe that everyone has two angels, one that records your good deeds and one that records your bad deeds. And you can find this in Surah chapter 50 and verse 17. Now the fourth belief is in holy books, in their holy books. Muhammad taught that Allah has provided 4 books to mankind. The first is the Law of Moses, the second is the Psalms of David, the third is the Gospel of Jesus, and the fourth is the Quran. And we can't forget about one more important collection of writings to the Muslims, and these are called the Hadith. This collection of writings records many sayings and deeds of Muhammad. So although it's important, it is not considered as authoritative as the Quran. Now, to the Muslim, the Quran supersedes all other holy writings, and this is because Muhammad taught that the books that came before him or before the Quran had been corrupted. However, the vast amount of manuscript evidence and copies that we have today has disproven the argument that the writings Muhammad refers to in the Bible have been corrupted. We now know and can have strong confidence in the fact that our Bibles today largely resemble the Bibles that the early Christians used 2,000 years ago. Number 5, the last belief that we're going to look at is in final judgment. So the Quran teaches that all humans will be physically resurrected on what it calls the last day. A person's deeds will be judged, and that individual will either spend eternity in heaven, Surah 4:57, or hell, Surah 4:56, and chapter 14 and verse 48 through 51. So we just kind of ran through some basic beliefs that a Muslim will most likely hold. And there's also 5 pillars of the Islamic practice, and these are confession, prayer, giving, fasting, and lastly pilgrimage. So some of those would seem like similar things to what the Christian might do, but the pilgrimage is interesting. It is required within Islam that all who are physically and financially able, they make a pilgrimage to Mecca at least once in their lifetime. And you'll find that in Surah chapter 2 and verse 196. So again, we've covered some kind of basic ideas and the pillars of the Islamic faith and practice. And as we talked at the beginning, just kind of about a brief background. And next, I just want to look at kind of how Islam initially grew, and how it grew to be just something that is as big as it is today. Initially, when Muhammad was attempting to bring his culture from a polytheistic society to a monotheistic society, which we talked about earlier, his following was relatively small. He and his group were actually persecuted early on for what they were trying to do and what they were trying to teach, and what they were trying to bring the people of that time to. So much so that they had to flee Mecca after an assassination attempt was made on Muhammad's life. In AD 622, he fled to a much friendlier city, which is about 250 miles away north, and it was called Medina. And in AD 630, just 8 years later, Muhammad, he returned to Mecca with an army and conquered the city after a few military conquests or battles won prior to that. He returned to Mecca and conquered the city. By AD 638, this was now 6 years after the death of Muhammad, Muslims seized the Holy Land by force. Within the course of that first century, really Muslim armies spread the Islamic Empire into Central Asia, into the confines of China, across North Africa, and all the way to the shores of the Atlantic Ocean in southern France and Spain, until they were halted and stopped in France in AD 732. So they covered a decent amount of ground. And Islam owes a large share of its growth to military conquest through jihad. Now, this is a vastly different story than the early growth of Christianity. And Christianity grew not by force, but actually through persecution that was experienced early on. The early church, the early Christians, they were the ones that faced persecution. Jesus' most devoted followers were martyred for their faith in the resurrection of Jesus and for preaching the gospel. If you think about Paul, or previously known as Saul, he was a persecutor of the church. He went around and imprisoned Christians. He went around and murdered Christians. So this was kind of the state that, or the conditions that the church grew within and out of. So obviously both these beginnings are vastly different. And obviously we should ask and answer the question, is Islam a religion of peace or a religion of war? Well, the answer to that question is yes, because it advocates for both. The early teachings of Muhammad, while he was still in Mecca, when he was part of really a religious minority, he had more moderate tones of peace and tolerance towards other religions. You can find that an example would be Surah chapter 2, verse 190, Surah 29, verse 46. But after Muhammad had gained numerous followers and political power, and really amassed an army, then he began to contradict himself by advocating for a much more hostile attitude toward people of other faiths. An example would be Surah chapter 8, verse 39, where it says, "Make war on them until idolatry shall cease and God's religion shall reign supreme." Surah 9:5, "So when the sacred months have passed away, then slay the idolaters wherever you find them and take them captives and besiege them and lie in wait for them in every ambush. Then if they repent and keep up prayer and pay the poor rate, leave their way free to them." Surah 9:29 says, "Fight those who believe not in Allah nor the last day, even if they are of the people of the book," that could be referencing Jews or Christians, "until they pay the tax and they are in a state of subjection." So you kind of have both. And again, his Muhammad's later writings have a tone that's a little bit more aggressive towards people that are non-believers. So again, the answer to that question is yes. The Quran advocates for peace, but also hostility and aggression and war. So I want to move on to some difficulties for the Muslim, some difficulties for the Muslim that are based on uh, majority based on the Quran itself. So within the Quran, there are clear scientific contradictions. There's clear scientific contradictions. Look at Surah chapter 18 and verse 86. It says this: "Until when he reached the setting of the sun, he found it setting in a murky spring and found a people in its vicinity." So we're taught here that someone actually found the sun sitting in a murky spring and people were in its vicinity. We obviously know that the sun is a massive star that is much bigger than the Earth, and there really is no possibility that it could be found on Earth. Another issue or scientific contradiction is that it suggests that the sky can fall on the inhabitants of the earth. Surah 22, verse 65 says this: "Do you not see that God made everything on earth subservient to you? How the ships sail at sea by his command, that he holds up the sky lest it falls on earth, except by his permission." And also in Surah 34, verse 9, it says this: "Do they not reflect upon what lies before them and behind them, of the heaven and the earth? If we will, we can make the earth cave in beneath them, or make pieces of the sky fall down on them. In that is a sign for every devout servant." There's other examples, such as the stars flying away when Abraham looks at them. Surah 37 verses 88 through 90. Mountains that were created to hold down the earth and prevent earthquakes. Surah 31 verse 10 through 11. Another example, meteors that are a form of divine retribution being hurled at devils who might try to spy on the heavenly council. Surah 37, verse 6 through 10 says this: "We have adorned the lower heaven with the beauty of the planets and guarded it against every defiant devil. They cannot eavesdrop on the supernal elite, for they get bombarded from every side. Repelled, they will have lingering torment, except for him who snatches a fragment. He gets pursued by a piercing projectile." Surah 72, verse 8 through 9 says, "We probed the heaven and found it filled with stern guards and projectiles. We used to take up positions to listen in, but whoever listens now finds a projectile in wait for him." So not only are there clear scientific contradictions, but there's also some historical contradictions. There's one well-attested fact about human history, and that is the fact that Jesus was put to death by crucifixion on a cross. This is well attested. This isn't really debated or argued anymore. But the Quran states otherwise. Surah chapter 4, verse 157 says this: and for their saying, we have killed the Messiah, Jesus, the son of Mary, the messenger of God. In fact, they did not kill him, nor did they crucify him, but it appeared to them as if they did. Indeed, those who differ about him are in doubt about it. They have no knowledge of it, except the following of assumptions. Certainly, they did not kill him. So this is a historical contradiction. There's also clear internal contradictions. So it tells us that Noah and his family survived the flood in one place, Surah 21, verse 76. But then it also says that one of Noah's sons drowned. Surah chapter 11, verse 42, verse 40 to 43. Another example is the fact that it says that Pharaoh drowned chasing the Israelites. Surah 28:40, Surah 17:103, Surah 43, verse 55. But then in other locations, it says that Pharaoh survived, repented, and was saved from drowning. Surah chapter 10, verse 90 through 92. And there's over 100 of these known contradictions. These were just a few examples. Now, here's a really interesting point that the Quran seems to suggest. The Quran seems to suggest that Jews and Christians should follow their own books, their own holy books, or their own writings. Surah chapter 5 and verse 43, verse to the beginning of verse 44 says this: "But why do they come to you," speaking of Muhammad, "for judgment, when they have the Torah, in which is God's law? Yet they turn away after that. These are not believers." Verse 44, "We have revealed the Torah, wherein is guidance and light." So the question is asked, why do they come to Muhammad? Because they have the Torah, which is God's law. And the Torah is guidance and light. Verse 46 through 47 goes on. It says this: "In their footsteps we sent Jesus, son of Mary, fulfilling the Torah that preceded him, and we gave him the gospel, wherein is guidance and light." Again, guidance and light. "And confirming the Torah that preceded him," confirming the Torah that is God's law and guidance and light, "and guidance and counsel for the righteous." So the gospel is then guidance and counsel for the righteous, it seems to be suggesting. Verse 47, "So let the people of the gospel rule according to what God revealed in it. Those who do not rule according to what God revealed are the sinners." So it would be sinful for the Christian to not rule according to what God has revealed in the Gospels. For the Gospels are guidance and light, and the Gospels are what God has revealed. It's very interesting. So even if the Quran is true, it defeats itself, because then the Torah and the Gospels would also be true, and both make truth claims that are contradictory to the Quran. So yes, the Quran seems to suggest that Christianity is true. So the last thing that I would like to discuss is what I believe to be very important. And I think that Islam does have a deficient view of who God is. Oftentimes they will argue that their view of God is an elevated view of God because Allah doesn't have a son or anything like that, or doesn't condescend to us here down on earth. But I think Islam does have a deficient view of God, because by definition God would be a maximally great being. A maximally great being is a being that lacks nothing. We can also think of this maximally great being as the greatest conceivable being. The Islamic view of God is not the greatest conceivable being. The greatest conceivable being would be a being who is maximally great. Like I said already, this being would be all-powerful, all-knowing, all-present, and all-loving. They would have all of the omni attributes. And this love, specifically, the all-loving nature, this love would be unconditional, impartial, and universal, or extended to all people. Now, this is where the deficiency comes in for Islam, or for the Muslim. Allah is not the greatest conceivable being because Allah is not all-loving. He lacks in love. His love is partial, it is conditional, and it is not universal. It does not extend to all people. He does not love sinners or unbelievers, based on what the Quran has to say. So the God of the Quran would not be an upgraded view of God in comparison to the God of the Bible. Now, I've given you a lot of information on Islam and on the Quran. And so I hope that's been somewhat helpful to you. I hope that you can kind of take some things and maybe dig into it a little bit more, or use some things in a discussion with a Muslim friend, or things like that. But I hope that that was helpful. I hope I kind of gave you just a brief understanding of Islam and uh, some of the beliefs, and also just the issues that their holy book has, and their view of God has, and so on. So I hope that was helpful. I'd love to hear your thoughts on today's episode. But for now, that will do it. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you have any questions, again, some thoughts about the episode, comments, or anything like that, please send me an email to ryanhomespodcast@gmail.com. Don't forget to visit ryanhomespodcast.locals.com to join our community. I appreciate any support. And if you are on YouTube, like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell. And ultimately, please share this podcast, and let's encourage others to think about their faith and live it out. See you next week.